Hello, I'm Pete Howard from Altran, and thanks for taking an interest in this talk. I've gained a fair expertise in choosing software developers and hiring them over the years, but what I wanted to see if I could do would be to kind of turn it inside out, to see if I could turn what I've learnt into information for helping people looking for jobs. And this talk is the result. These are my credentials. On average, I've probably hired 10 people a year over about 26 years. And if you multiply that by 7, which is how many interviews you typically do before you decide to make somebody an offer, and then if you multiply it by about 11, which is about how many applications you might receive before you decide to interview somebody, I've come to realise I've probably read about 20,000 CVs. But over that time I've also had an opportunity to get better at it, because first of all I've read and studied the topic quite a bit, but probably the most valuable thing is I've had the benefit of closed loop feedback, by which I mean I've been responsible for delivering the software that the people I choose can make, and so I've had the opportunity to gradually refine it on the basis of what happens based on the choices I make. This is orientation. You don't need me to tell you there's no silver bullet for any of this, nor that it's hard work, although in a presentation I'm going to try and make the case that it's harder work than you think, and that you should probably work harder than most people I see working to get jobs. I'm going to make a big fuss about how it's illogical, chaotic and unfair, but I'm also going to show that that actually creates opportunities for you and coping mechanisms. I'm going to make a big fuss about the fact that it's competitive. You have to treat it as a battle or a competition, you've got to win it. And we're going to talk a bit about how, if you're a typical software engineer, you may be a bit outside your comfort zone with some of this stuff and how we can push through that. And I'm going to encourage you to look at your own limitations, because that can really help you. So, okay. Bit of a negative slide, but there's only one more negative one, and then we start going on the uphill side. So my challenge to you is to say, well, what do you expect? If somebody offers you a job or gives you a job, they're going to invest in you the price of several houses over several years. It's a big deal. If, like me, you're most at home, most comfortable working with technology, this is different. This is about human beings. It's about people and their interactions. You're trying to influence and persuade people that don't care about you, which is a theme I'll develop. And this isn't what you're good at. You're probably a very good software engineer, but this probably isn't your comfort zone. So we should expect it to be difficult. We should expect to have to work hard. And I think the payoff equation makes it all perfect sense. What price happiness? Why do a job you don't like to earn lots of money, maybe retire early or something like that? Why not just do a job you do like? Why not have a life you like? If we accept that the process of finding jobs and applying for them and so forth causes things to happen to you which aren't necessarily very nice, then this message for life is very useful. It's not what happens to you, it's how you react. And my kind of epiphany on this concept was when I read this book. Although it turns out, as you can see here, that the idea has been around rather longer. But Covey's point is that how something affects you really is pretty much down to how you decide to react, which is your choice. Not what happens to you, which maybe isn't your choice. This is one of several books I'm going to endorse, by the way, but they all come with a health warning, and the health warning is this. If you take this one, for example, it's rather dated, it's rather corny, it's rather American, it's rather religious, all of which, may make it, in your eyes, not quite so good, but I think you need to push through that. And when books are as penetrating as this, it's very important to take out of them what you can, rather than being put off by the things that you don't like. Right, when you see a slide like this, it means I'm changing the subject, going on to a new topic. And we're going to define dream. We're going to define the word dream in finding your dream job. The way to work out what your dream job is perhaps surprisingly not to study the job, it's to study yourself. And my advice to you is to study yourself and reach an enhanced level of understanding of who you are, using various systematic measures, and then to measure up any job you come across in those terms rather than the other way around. Don't reverse engineer. You will all have met a junior software engineer who writes some software and then is asked to write some automated tests for it, and writes a test that proves it does what it's already doing, which you may chuckle about, but it happens all the time. Whereas, of course, what you should do is hypothesize what the correct result should be, write a test which checks that those are indeed the results, and then it's actually doing something useful. Well, don't fall into the same trap. If you know better in software, know better in finding your perfect job, define yourself first. This book, What Colour is Your Parachute, is a good read. It's one of the most well-known and respected, if a little dated, books on the topic. But I'm also going to talk about a self-administered personality test, which is quite good fun, and for me has been very revealing about myself, in the next slide. This is the Myers-Briggs personality indicator, and each of these 4 columns they call a dichotomy. You can think of it as a sort of slider, but instead of being nothing at the bottom and a lot at the top, they're thing A at the bottom and thing B at the top. And each person has a sort of tendency which places them so far along the slider, and it shows their personal emphasis between those two, usually sort of opposite-ish characteristics. And once you've been measured, you essentially pick a letter from each column. So for me, for example, I'm an ENTJ. And once you've done it, and you can find these tests to self-administer on the internet, or you can pay to have more thorough ones done. Once you've done it, you can go onto the internet and you can say, what's an ENTJ like, or whatever your type is, and you'll get back sort of a couple of pages of typical, down-to-earth, practical observations about what that sort of person is like. And I found it pretty remarkable in terms of what it can tell, particularly given there's only 16 categories. The whole of humanity is divided into 16 categories, yet it seems to be able to characterise behaviour. This is a quick and dirty jotting from me about the things, what I perceive to be my main weaknesses. So I don't like inefficiencies, which of course isn't a bad thing, but I actually take it to extremes, and if something's really inefficient, I get so angry and so frustrated that I get really quite moody, and it ruins my ability to think. I'm very motivated when I've got a mission, to the point that I'm actually quite obsessive sometimes. But if I'm completely honest, when I haven't got a mission, I can become really rather sort of tawdry and lazy. I'm quite happy thinking about long-term things, but if I'm honest, I'm not so great at short-term deadlines and what has got to be done right now. And I love thinking in big, sweeping concepts, but I really need people to help me on attention to detail. I like judgment rather than loyalty. If my wife says, does my bum look big in this? I say, well, let's have a look, let's see. And then I tell her the truth, which is really dumb. Sometimes judgment is really important, that it does trump loyalty, but other times that's not the right answer. And I'm impatient to the point that I can seem hasty and bombastic. I think I pretty much managed to keep a lid on that at work, but I'm not so successful at home. And I hope that I've got a reasonably sophisticated seeming response to other people's feelings and behaviours that are concerned by feelings. But if I'm honest, it doesn't come into my sort of input device driver as a feeling. It comes in as a recognition of a set of patterns. I think, oh, right, that means that person's feeling this, and therefore I can behave this way. Now, it's very interesting to compare that with what Myers-Briggs says. If you type in ENTJ into Google, I'll just give you a moment to read those things. But the point is, they coincide absolutely perfectly with my own sort of feeling of how I am. And I think for 4 letters, which only discriminate people into 16 groups, to get that kind of match is something magical. Now you're equipped to measure up jobs to see how well they fit you. And it's important to try and work out the contextual things that are going to make a difference to how fulfilled you're going to be. So instead of thinking, well, like most people do, well, the main thing for me is a technical challenge, that's what motivates me. Try and ask yourselves questions which extrapolate from that, like, well, who is it that's got to be satisfied with what I do for me to feel fulfilled? Is it the boss? Is it my peer? Is it an end user? Is it just myself? Is it internal? Do you want to have a lot to do with your end users of your software? Do you like a formal company culture or an entrepreneurial company culture? Think about what constitutes excellence in that organisation. It might be that the software is provably correct, it might be that it's particularly nice looking, it might be that it came to the market before anybody else's. There's 101 different versions of excellence. That will tell you a lot about whether a job will match you. Do you like to be given a lot of control so that you can sort of have objectives and be satisfied by meeting them, or do you like to have a bit more headroom and somebody to say, look, just go away and make the problem go away for me, please, and you can design the entire thing? Do you thrive on a bit of pressure, or are you more concerned with your work-life balance? Do you like collaborating with other people? Really? Do you want to go out and represent your organisation to other people, or would you prefer somebody else to do that? Do you want to have philosophical, erudite conversations when you make a cup of coffee with your friends, or do you want to have a bit of a laugh and a giggle with your friends? Board meetings means how central to the company's fundamental mission software is. Does software get spoken about at board meetings? It probably does at Google, and it probably doesn't at Legal & General. Do you like lots of variety in your work, or do you want to become an expert in something? How much do you tolerate, or how much at least are you fulfilled if you're doing maintenance of software and support rather than greenfield development? Do you like to travel? That's not trivial. Does it mean having to go somewhere every month, year in, year out? Or does it mean going to different places once in a blue moon? For how long? How far away? On your own or with others? Do you want your management to be collaboration minded, or do you want them to be very well organised? Or do you want them to leave you alone? Do you want them to have technical understanding? Does it matter to you? Think about what the company does and the impacts that has on the development culture. If they make a product, there'll almost certainly be people other than you deciding what the software should be. Whereas if it's a service, that might not be the case. It might be your customer deciding what the software should be. If it's a startup company, it's quite likely what the software should be changes according to the direction of the wind. If you're in a public company, publicly owned company, there's usually a more restrained, controlled, sort of level culture. If you're in a commercial company, it all comes down to money. Having software that's on time and adequate is far more important having software that's brilliant but too late. If you're in the defence market, you might not be able to tell anybody about it. How's that going to make you feel? You know, how hung up are you about what people are going to use your software for a moral basis? And finally, think about size. If you're in a small company, you get to do many more different things, and you can feel as if you're part of the machine. You're influencing it. If you're in a great big company, sometimes you don't get the influence you would wish, but you get lots of other benefits, lots of services to support you, and maybe you can stay in one place for a long time and still expect to have a career path within that organisation. I put the X Factor picture on this slide to remind us that being deluded is perhaps more prominent amongst people and maybe amongst ourselves than we realise. And it's important to remember that we're speaking about trying to get your dream developer job, not trying to get a job because you're desperate. And if you're going to get your dream development job, it's all about, as I said earlier, matching up who you are with the job. And so recognising your limitations is really valuable to you. We spoke before about being happy by cutting out the middleman and getting a life that you like. The other thing is that once you've come to terms with your limitations and you've found a way of approaching, kind of selling yourself to get a job, by definition, all you've got to do is sell who you really are. And that gives you the power of mastery. You know, what could be easier than thrusting forward and projecting who you really are? Okay, I'm going to talk about some techniques to make sure the communication works well. But if you don't come to terms with your limitations, you could easily get tripped up when you're trying to project yourself, because you'll stumble over one of your limitations and it'll go very badly wrong. So, a key change coming up. We're now going to speak about how you find these dream opportunities. There are three primary methods for finding job opportunities. And this fellow here is a metaphor for responding to a job advert. He's shooting down an opportunity that's floating past him. This net is a metaphor for going fishing for jobs, networking. And these fine fellows are the army, or how you can get an army to help you, by which I mean recruitment agencies. And we're going to look at each of those and characterise each of those next. If a job is being advertised, these things are what's good about that situation. Somebody's definitely going to spend some money. There's money in the pot ready. They're pretty much certainly going to hire someone, and you've got a clearly defined target to appeal to. But these things are the things that make them less optimal. There's going to be some kind of process which you've got to adhere to, which kind of cramps your style, and for the same reason you're obliged to fit in with how the HR machine of the company wants to deal with it, and you're up against competition. That's why I said at the bottom, probabilities and priorities. What I'm saying is that the probability that someone is going to be hired is very high, but the probability of you being that person is less high. I've said here, try to get the job. Should you try to get the job? It's a bit of a silly trick question, because what I mean is, no, you shouldn't try to get the job. You should try and get the interview. Now, this is one of the most important points of the whole presentation. There's three phases to this, and you'll do much better if you keep them separate. Think of them as three separate projects you're assigned to. Phase one is get the interview. and tailor every ounce of your energy to getting an interview, not getting a job. If you get the interview, you then switch mode and you target every ounce of your energy to getting an offer. If you get an offer, you then target every ounce of energy to negotiating. And by keeping them separately, you can do a much better job of each. And the way you approach each phase is different and must stand out. I've put that there because the most important thing if you're applying for a job that's advertised is to stand out from the crowd, and we're going to talk a bit more about that. The reason it's vital to stand out in the early stages of applying for a job is that you've got to become a human being in the mind of the person doing the selecting. Prior to that, you're just a statistic, a phenomena. In the old days, doctors used to speak of, when they were describing people in wards, they'd maybe use the expression, oh, that hernia in bed 6. They would sort of dehumanise it and reduce the person to a concept, and that's what you've got to elevate yourself from in this situation. Our company has a bid manager who entered the company by doing this. When he was down on his luck a bit, he went and banged on the front door and said, have you got any jobs? That was differentiating himself to great effect. And you can do it by doing anything off-piste, anything which isn't quite standard behaviour. You then become unique. So don't apply for the job, do something else instead. Obviously you're going to apply for the job, but what I mean is do something else as well. Maybe try and do some kind of reconnaissance, any pretext to reach out to the person and become a human being by your behaviour. And the reason this works is that you get this thing called reciprocity, which we're going to talk about later on. But the key thing is, once you become a human being, the sort of debt that the hirer has towards you to favour you is above that he has if you're still a statistic, so you're more likely to be pulled for interview. When I'm looking at job applications, it feels like I've got a problem the size of that stack of paper on the right, and you might think that what's going through my mind is who to choose for interview, but it's not. What's going through my mind is who to reject from that pile, because that's the dominant thing I need to achieve, is rejecting a very large number of people. And this is relevant and not well understood. You need to make yourself unrejectable at this stage, not irresistible. There's no point in polishing a point on the CV to make yourself irresistible if there's something you've overlooked or compromised which makes you rejectable. It's harsh, but you've got to deal with the reality of this. All you're trying to do is get pulled to interview. So if you write some stuff down which makes it impossible for the interviewer to reject you, they will pull you for interview to find out the rest. Wizziarty, what you see is all there is. And that leads on to whether you should tailor your CV. You shouldn't tailor your CV. You should write it from scratch against requirements. Pick out the requirements, say stuff against them, just what's necessary. What you see is all there is. You are therefore unrejectable and you'll be pulled for interview. If you apply to me and you've got medieval reenactment as one of your hobbies, I will find it almost impossible to resist certain prejudices I have because of the only two people I've ever met that did medieval reenactment and what they were like. And you'll find similar but equally bizarre prejudices, I dare say, in all hirers. So on that little detail, I suggest you don't put down hobbies. I can't see how it can help, really. You're trying to make yourself unresistible, remember? The person doing a rejection of CVs doesn't care about you as a person at this stage. They don't give a damn. So you really do have to try hard. And it should be requirements driven, and you might want to consider having a sort of life cycle for designing your application in the same way as you would for designing your code. And you might want to consider doing something rather akin to a code review. Code reviews will universally make code better, so why not get someone you can trust to look at your application? They'll almost certainly make it better too. If you know how to create good quality software, you can map that to make good quality applications. I'm going to try and bring together some of the things I've said in the last few slides with a use case, and I'm going to use a concrete example, which was a job I applied for some years ago. And I'm going to try and show how I designed the CV and why, and the covering letter. I'm going to try and show how I used the covering letter to make myself impossible to reject. And I'm going to show you about the way I was able to differentiate myself by doing something off-piste, this what I've called a PhD stunt. What happened in this particular case was I was slightly confused by the roles of the people that were going to be interviewing me when I got the interview. And when I googled around the people, I discovered that one of them had published a PhD, so I had a quick look at what it was. And I hit really lucky that the title, or the subject matter for the PhD, overlapped with some feature they'd put in the job description, so I figured, right, this bloke's pretty passionate about that and pretty expert about that. And as it happened, it was something I was pretty passionate about as well. It was how software engineers should be educated and how successful the various methods were in design patterns. And so that helped me to really differentiate myself, because you drop into the conversation once you meet the person that you've read it, and you're just streets ahead of everybody else then. This is the CV I submitted. That's it. It's one page. And if you've had anything to do with Unix, you'll have heard less is more. And the reason I put in a CV as short as this was I wanted to distract attention from it, because what I wanted to do was put in some more tailored material, which was going to do the real heavy lifting of this, of trying to differentiate myself. And by putting in a very short CV, made it possible. So I'm going to show you a little bit on the next slide what I put into that CV, but it's little more than a job history painted in a positive light, and a few juicy bits, like I've got a degree from a good university and I won a couple of prizes. Now, as I said, the CV didn't have a huge amount of substance, but I made sure that there were associations in there, which a quick skim read, which is what people are going to do, set up the right associations in your mind. So, accountable to divisional director, oh, he probably had some authority. He won a prize, he must be clever. A startup, HP Labs, oh, connected with HP Labs, they're pretty respectable. Revolutionary, Panasonic, they're a big name. Started as a graduate, ended up as something else. Oh, goodness, very respectable looking customers there. The idea is that this just sets up some heuristic associations and creates a good impression, and doesn't do any damage. This is the beginning of the cover letter, and I've tried and make myself stand out right at the beginning. I had no plans to consider a job change and was very content in my current job until circumstances conspired to make me aware of your company, etc., etc. So this is an attempt to make an opening statement which makes it sound a bit different. I've said that what I've learned about their company makes it sound thrilling. What would make me consider a change, in other words, I'm saying, look, I'm not desperate, I'm quite happy here, and therefore I'm probably quite good at what I do, but I would like to go somewhere where I could contribute to my highest potential, so I'm driven by sort of fairly laudable things. This is the next paragraph. It's picking up what's important to them. Your role and environment appeals to me because you made a big fuss about high quality software engineering in the materials you put out. It's a science-oriented value proposition, which I know would be important to them because that's what I do, and it's quite hard to get good software people that also know about science and maths. There's a strong entrepreneurial culture, which is self-evident from their website, and I like it, so I said so. They're growing well, which I want to be part of. Well, that's good. I understand that that's an important dimension of software, the entrepreneurial side. And then this was slightly risky, but I felt worthwhile, appeal to the guy who wrote the PhD. He used the word anti-patterns in the job description, and I've said that not only that I like that idea, but I was brave enough to say something slightly cocky about it, which I thought they might feel was appropriate for a sort of a leadership role. And then I said I'd be very eager to visit, because I wanted to explore and understand better what, if any, contribution I could make. Now, you may wonder why I said that, but it's easier for people to agree to something if by agreeing to it they're making a smaller commitment than otherwise. So if you say, I'll be very eager to visit to see if I can get the job, by agreeing they've got to face up to me coming to try and get the job. Whereas if they agree to this, subconsciously, there's no commitment. I'm just coming along to explore something with them and see if I can make a contribution. And here I just say, well, look, I've attached my CV, but look, I've said something more interesting which talks to your job specification in a separate document, and that's really where I want them to land, because that's the thing that's going to make the difference. And this is the document I was referring to. Each of these black lines is the points that they pulled out in their materials they put out, and so what I did was I just wrote out every single one, and I wrote a short paragraph under every different one that said essentially, yes, I can do that. That's making yourself impossible to reject. How can you, if you've put out 20 criteria and somebody says I've got an answer to all of those, and that's all they say, why would you not pull them to interview? I decided to answer the question about design patterns, which we established in what I said on the previous slide was probably pretty important for one of the people interviewing. And so I thought to myself, how can I get across the idea that I really do know about these things, to demonstrate a mastery? And so I came up with this slightly wacky answer, but again I thought, if that doesn't get the attention and some respect from this person that really matters in an interview, I don't know what will. Of course there's a problem here, isn't there? What if they ask for something that you don't know about? And that's what this was. Did I know about enterprise integration? And I could have just said, well, no, not really. So instead, I said, no, not really, this way. I know about something, and I've implemented one recently using those technologies, which between you and me meant I've used the one-click installer on the hosted website I've got. It was a technology exploration project. In other words, I just tried something. I've also done a very light touch evaluation of Google's App Engine. Again, I tried the one-click installer and quickly discovered it was cherry pie with a clever database. And then I just sort of drop in at the end. Having said that, I don't have solid industrial commercial experience of this class of development. So if you're going to say no, say it like that. So now we're going to change the subject and we're going to move on to finding jobs through networking or the hidden job market. There's a lot of debate about how many jobs are filled through non-traditional routes. And my advice is to not agonise over what that percentage is. Who cares? Some of them are. So let's think about not neglecting that in our mechanism. Because networking, I think, is very badly misunderstood or sometimes not understood at all, I'd like to start with a really simple definition that somebody came up for a 9-year-old. It's discovering if you can do something nice for somebody else. That serves pretty well. You'll see what I mean in a moment. This picture is a software developer that's just had it suggested to him that he does a bit of networking. And that reaction is what you would expect. That's typical, that's normal, and it's okay. But the truth is, you're probably better at networking than you think. And I often think that if people studied a bit more what networking was, how to do it, they wouldn't be so bothered about it, because the truth of it is that it's nowhere near as disturbing as most people think it is. In fact, it's not disturbing at all, it's quite fun. But it is important because ultimately when one person hires another, they're taking a risk, they're making a commitment from one person to another, and a bit of warmth between the two people will influence that decision a very great deal. And all that network is doing is creating volume for you. It's giving you exposure to more people with whom that might happen in a way that makes it slightly more likely that it will happen. The people who decide whether they're going to hire people don't just wake up one morning with a fully formed view. The ideas percolate and brew about what your staffing strategy is going to be. So often with these people there is a kind of nascent budget and role as the ideas develop in the person's mind. And if you're going to meet these people by networking, you can't target a job, of course, because it's not really fully formed yet, but you instead target the person. And the advantages of meeting somebody through networking for jobs is that you go straight round HR and go straight to the technical person. You also bypass the CV process. And the challenge I spoke of earlier of becoming a human being in the selector's eyes happens just automatically and instantly if you meet the person. It also gives you an opportunity to talk about some genuinely mutually interesting topics, technical topics, with the interviewer. If two people have a conversation with each other where they're both talking about something they're both interested in, that generates a huge amount of warmth, which is really good news. And of course also, if you're suitable for one of these nascent jobs, it might even influence the person's thinking about how to design their organisation, and competition haven't got a prayer in that situation. This is generally accepted as the best book around on the topic, and I'll happily endorse it, despite several aspects of it which have me shouting at the walls in irritation. But seriously, it's got good content, it's an easy, brisk read, and you wouldn't better read this without coming out afterwards with a sense of, yeah, okay, I really get it, and okay, I'm happy with it, and okay, I'm confident enough to go and give it a go. A good way of choosing circles to network in is to think about real people with names, not abstract people that could hire you, and find out where they might go to pursue their technical interests, and you go there too. Take along a business card with your name, your phone number and email address on it, and don't get too hung up about handing out business cards. It's not as hard as people think. All you've got to say is, after a conversation or during a conversation, oh look, can I just give you this? It's got my name on it and my contact details. There's no great ritual. You have to approach these situations determined to give something to the other person, and you have to mean it rather than just pretend. And of course you do want something back, but you mustn't expect something back there and then. What you get back is on a statistical long-term basis. It's not tit for tat during the conversation. People struggle sometimes to talk to other people in these situations, but people like talking to other people that are interested in them. So the key is to ask people about things that they're interested in and not just talk about yourself. But you do have to be patient. This is a long-term thing. I've said as a bit of a joke, you've got to start 2 years before you need it, but really it's actually a lifestyle choice if you want to make it work. Try not to be the first person to say, so what do you do then? Usually somebody else will ask you that, and then it's perfectly alright to reciprocate. But if you do ask somebody what they do, it sounds a bit like fishing. These are some networking circles I used recently for my job. I wanted to meet people that were involved in chip engineering, so I went to a place where all the experts gathered to talk about the latest things in how to verify chips. I went to a programming interested group in Bristol, and if you think about it, they're very good because all the programmers are employed by people that employ programmers. The Technology Strategies Board is a super one. They actually organise lots of formal networking events. If you go to their website, it's called -connect or underscore connect, you'll find a very, very rich seam of networking events you can go along to. The MIA is a trade association, the Motorsports Industry Trade Association. Trade associations do a lot of networking events, and often non-members can go along. But then there's also your personal opportunities like activities and clubs. And this bright logo is a builder I met recently when he was doing some work on my dad's house. Got chatting to him and said, "How did you get into this lark then?" He said, "Oh, I've only just recently started. I've spent most of my career working in Oracle." Just goes to show what sort of thing can happen. There are some very good agencies, but the trick is how to find out which ones, because it's not a very high proportion. What I would suggest you do is speak to agencies and ask them some questions which will help you judge how well they really understand what software development is and how intimate a relationship they've got with the hirers. Maybe ask them if they can tell you what the sort of foibles and personal style of the hirers that they're working with are, because if they can't answer those questions, they probably don't have a very clear, good relationship with the hirer. It's an unfortunate truth that they do have to be ruthless to candidates. The economics make it that way. But a bit like the books, you've got to put up with that. They can still be helpful despite that. And people forget they're experts. They've devoted their careers to getting good at getting people jobs. So, of course, they can help you. Should you bypass them if you think you can? Well, it all depends on whether or not you think you can reach the hirer directly and convert yourself from the statistic into the human being image, as we spoke of earlier. If you can do that, then yes, because that's really valuable. But otherwise, no, let them wield their skills. And look after them, treat them with respect. If they really do have an intimate relationship with the hirer, which our preferred suppliers often will, they'll tell us how you behave. And people say they're only advertising because they want to get people into their databases. Well, you want to be in their databases too, because a lot of jobs are placed by CVs that come on the same day as the agencies are notified by hirers, and they've just got them out of their database. So sometimes a job will be tied up before it's even ever advertised. It may never be advertised. So you can beat your better competitor by being there first. So we've come to another key change, and we're now going to have a section of the talk which is about the psychological and subconscious aspects of the whole job process. To get us going, which of these two gentlemen would you prefer to handle your vasectomy operation? You probably saw that coming, didn't you? But the point I'm making is, you know this already, first impressions have an inordinate importance to us, and that's just probably the most famous example of how our subconscious mind influences us, and the rest of this section is more of the same. Much of this section that follows is heavily influenced by me reading this book, and I want to endorse this book pretty strongly, to a point that I'm almost worried about being ridiculous, but I must admit I found it extraordinary. It's a riveting page turner for the intelligent mind. The things that it reveals to you have a sort of real wow factor, but it somehow on top of that manages to have a style and quality about it. It's kind of refined, it's humble, it's elegant. Oh, for goodness sake, man, get a grip. It's a book. That's another one which covers a great deal of the same stuff, and its chief merit is that it's shorter and more to the point, but I know which I'd choose. I think most of us think that we can defeat the subconscious thinking process once we've understood the phenomena a bit, but the authorities and the evidence would suggest that we delude ourselves about that, and this is rather a good example. The tiles that are labelled A and B are the same colour. Well, of course they're not, you find yourself saying. So to prove it, what I did is I used a graphics program to actually cut out little fragments of A and B and put them next to it. Here they are. There's one and there's the other. And there's no sleight of hand there. They are the same colour. And the explanation we're given for this is that when you see something in shadow, you've learnt from life experience that the colours you see will appear to be darker than they really are, and so your brain automatically makes it lighter to compensate. Which is all very well, but now you know that, you should better look at those squares A and B and say, well, now I can sort of undo that, but you can't. And even when you know perfectly well that your mind is, if you like, playing tricks, sometimes you can't do anything about it. This slide is a rather vivid example of how even really quite absurd and tenuous things in our subconscious can create very potent and powerful phenomena in the outcomes of our thinking. This was an experiment that was conducted, and it was a bunch of, I think, students or researchers who had the shared use of a kitchen, and they were supposed to put some money in an honesty pot to pay for the milk that they put in their tea and their coffee. And unbeknown to the people using the kitchen, these researchers had got into the habit of replacing a picture on the wall of the kitchen, which nobody really paid any attention to, once a week. And these pictures down the left-hand side are the pictures that they used. And the graph shows for as each week went along on the vertical axis, how much people paid on average for their milk and coffee, a sort of measure of honesty. And you'll see that for every other week, there's a strikingly different level of honesty. There's a pattern. And if you look at the pictures, you'll see that every other week the picture contained a pair of eyes. And it was shown that what was happening is that we subconsciously think of the presence of a pair of eyes, even in a picture, as there being scrutiny around the place. When we're subject to scrutiny, we're more honest. Now, if that doesn't prove that really quite big outcomes can occur with some very tenuous subconscious triggers, I don't know what does. Here's a question for you. In what sized groups did Moses take the animals into the ark? Now, most people answer 2, whereas the more intelligent response is it wasn't Moses, it was Noah. And the reason most people don't spot that is because the biblical context and the word Moses is a coherent group, and therefore you don't spot the anomaly. Our subconscious doesn't really spot anomalies, it looks for patterns, and if it sees a pattern it's happy to leap upon it even if it's not quite right. And this is probably the most significant key core psychological error of judgment we make, and we exploit it during the finding a job process by using the establishment of associations to lead the interviewer's mind. Most people, when they read this description of Stephen, conclude that he's more likely to be a librarian because the stereotype fits. He's actually more likely to be a farmer because the statistics of the population density of farmers and librarians, particularly male ones, makes it far more likely that that's the dominant factor. And it's a very, very powerful and useful tool, this, in the job process, because people's subconsciousness will completely ignore statistics as if they didn't exist, and they'll make the heuristic stereotypes fit. So when you come to trot out your stories, which we're going to talk about later on, which will create various associations between you and your behaviours, they will overpower any statistical evidence to the contrary, and you should focus on creating these impressions, and they'll win. This speaks about a study that was done of the performance of schools in a certain region in the States. And the region contained 1,662 schools, and the schools were appraised according to the quality of their exam results. And it was found that the top 50 performing schools had small schools overrepresented amongst them. And people thought, well, that's not really surprising. Small schools are likely to have a very warm sense of community, perhaps good behaviour, maybe dedicated teachers, perhaps a bit more imagination in the teaching approaches. And so it all made perfect sense. And a charitable foundation invested $1.7 billion in trying to increase the number of small schools. But if you were to look at the amount of variation in the results that would occur because the samples were smaller in small schools, you would see that that explains completely the overrepresentation of small schools. And it's highly likely that if you'd studied instead the bottom 50 performers, that section too would have had small schools overrepresented for the same reason. And this is a I think, wonderful example of how our subconscious judgment, and even our conscious judgment actually, finds it virtually impossible, even for well-educated minds, to adjust the meaning we attach to statistics in accordance with how significant they are based on sample size. And I wish I could think of a way of applying this to the whole job process, but I can't. But I was just so impressed I thought I'd put it in this section because it might keep you amused. We've all experienced the sensation of having driven somewhere and then wondering how we got there because we didn't appear to give any thought to the driving process and we were actually thinking about something else. In Kahneman's book, he talks of us having sort of two people in our heads, if you like, System 1 and System 2 doing our thinking, with System 1 being the subconscious. And it's the subconscious that gets us there. But the subconscious can't cope with things which don't follow the sort of subconscious processing rules, like very unexpected things. And he talks of cognitive ease. When you're at cognitive ease, this System 1 comes to the fore and governs more of your thinking. And a skilled interviewer will put you into that state by giving you a nice time and having a nice, gentle, fun interview. And you will make your subconsciousness will show flaws which the interviewer will know about, and he'll gain more information about you. You'll be in less control of the information that comes out of you. So it's a fairly simple recipe, is by all means relax and go with the flow in the interview, but don't stop concentrating. Think of the duck analogy and paddle furiously underwater to make sure that you keep that System 2 doing the work. Two groups of people were conditioned differently. One was left alone and the other was exposed to this phrase, literally stopping at the word is lots of times without them realising it. And then later they were asked how true they thought it was that the average weight of a chicken was 2 kilograms. And the first group thought it was more likely to be true, which is astonishing. And it's been shown that the repetition of a phrase makes sentences containing that phrase seem more true. So if in an interview you mention the word process a lot, sprinkle it in, subconsciously the interviewer will think you're a process person. You're oriented in a sort of process way. You don't even have to say so. If that's something you want to get across, mention the word. Very powerful. There's been some very good research to show that first impressions are caused by, firstly, you judging how somebody is disposed towards you, a sort of measure of trust, and secondly, by how strong they are. And it's believed that the evolutionary reason for this is that you need to know whether someone's going to attack you or be nice to you, and then you need to know whether it matters very much, which will depend on your relative power. That picture, by the way, is a trust roof. It's the best I can come up with for trust. So you can engineer this when you meet somebody for an interview in the first time. It's very easy. All you have to do is be particularly nice and respectful and warm and open and humble. That will give you the trust impression. And then deliberately and soon afterwards, just say something which shows that you're a clear decision maker and have a bit of strength. And you've nailed it. That's the first impression. If you very quickly read these two descriptions of Alan and Ben, and then ask yourselves which one comes across better, most people will choose Alan. And this is despite the fact that the list of words that follow each of their names is the same. It's only the order that's different. But this is something the psychologists called the availability bias. And if the first two words create a certain impression, you will subconsciously interpret the words that follow in that context. So if you take, for example, impulsive, if it's someone that's intelligent and industrious, you'll think of it as a sort of impish, cheeky, constructive, helpful impulsiveness. It's jolly. If, however, you've read envious and stubborn and then impulsive, you'll see it as more of a dangerous, reckless tendency. Now the reason you can use this in interviews is you can make sure that when you bring out your stories, which you're going to learn about towards the end of the presentation to try and get messages across, you've only got to get a few good stories out near the beginning and you've kind of made it, because everything you say after that will be interpreted in the context of the flattering red mist that will have been created. If I told you that I had my weight pretty well under control and I had a bit of colour in my cheeks and that I ate a good diet and that I was a happy chappy and my hobbies included some fairly active sports, you would probably think, oh, he's healthy then. And you'd be wrong. I have some quite serious health problems. But this is a demonstration of the principle that we mentioned earlier. What you see is all there is. If you only know a few things about me, you will extrapolate heuristics and be quite satisfied that I'm completely defined by the things that you do know. Now that's very, very important in both a CV and a covering letter and an interview. And as you build your stories, think very carefully about everything you say in advance, plan it so that what you see is what the interviewer needs to know, and try and avoid saying anything else. Things that aren't positively contributing to helping you, as I said before, they're worse than redundant, they can be a liability. So now we're going to move on to interview craft. I hope I've emphasised enough now that the single objective of the interview is to secure a job offer and nothing else, and that you must focus on that to the exclusion of everything else. If it comes up in conversation though, that's probably a bit too ruthless to be quite the right answer, and it's better to say something like, look, everybody understands that you've got to scrutinise me to see whether I'm suitable for your organisation and your role, and you recognise that I've got to do the same thing to you to an extent, so it's hopefully a bit of a meeting of minds. Having said that, it's probably better if you don't actually speak any of your scrutiny, so while you can be furiously scrutinising, if you like, underwater, don't ask any questions which are in the nature of scrutiny. That doesn't help. The general rule is prepare very carefully, listen extremely carefully to the questions, respond to the question with a story which includes the answer to the question, but also hopefully ticks off a whole bunch of other boxes at the same time because you've prepared it so carefully, and then stop speaking. People find it very difficult not to speak in interviews, but it's not your responsibility to speak apart from answering questions. It's the interviewer's responsibility to keep the thing moving. And if you're disciplined about only speaking in terms of prepared stories, the overall quality of what you come across will be superb. Should you try and outfox the interviewer? By and large, no. By and large, the interviewer will have more experience of interviewing than you, just on a statistical likelihood basis, which means they're likely to have developed a craft almost by accident as a minimum, and deliberately in some cases. So you're not going to kind of outfox the interviewer. You're also under much more pressure. You're facing up to a situation that could potentially affect your whole life, whereas the interviewer is facing up to a situation which is going to govern how he has to spend his time for an hour and a half or whatever it is. There is no comparison, so you're really not on a strong footing to try and outfox the interviewer, and you don't really have to. But there is a slight element of it, which we're going to talk about in the next slide, which is this story approach, having a body of stories to pull out, and the mopping up approach. And you're going to do that regardless of the competence of the interviewer, but it'll do you more good with an inexperienced interviewer. People always say just be yourself, which is, I think, extremely good advice, but probably not quite enough. I think what you really have to do is be an extremely well-prepared version of yourself. And I've said know yourself and be lucid, in brackets how, and really this story technique I'm going to talk about in a moment is the how. So this is the technique I keep promising I'm going to start talking about, the story technique. And if ever there was an oxymoron, this is one. What you need to have is a little stock of prepared, spontaneous stories. You should be able to prepare quite a long list of things that it's quite likely the interviewer is going to try and find out about you, and I'll give you some help with that in the upcoming slides. And then what you need to do is you need to think of stories from your own experience that you can speak about with conviction and easily and lucidly, which mop up answers to the questions. Now clearly you need to have many fewer stories than there are potential things they could ask. You don't want to try and remember 100 stories. So try and get some coverage, like you get test coverage with code. And try and prepare stories which maybe target 6 or 10 or even a dozen things you want to get across. And the simple act of telling that story will just be blasting through the interviewer's explicit or implicit checklist. In my case it's implicit. I've got a very detailed checklist, but I've been using it for so long I know it off by heart. And when candidates are telling me things in seemingly random, chaotic ways, I'm mentally ticking boxes on my checklist. And actually when the interviewer leaves, I do actually tick the boxes from memory. And this is a way of getting across a spontaneous but very positive, very controlled, but seemingly natural way of ticking the boxes you need to. And I think I mentioned earlier this first impression thing. If the first few you bring out, if you tell 3 little stories and you've covered, I don't know, even if there are only 6 points in each, you've got 18 ticks. And that enough, it gives you enough of a wave that you're unlikely for the interview to go backwards from there. The story should say how you've shined for real. And don't forget, you only need one example. What you see is all there is. If you give one example of how you did something particularly well, you are good at that thing now in the interviewer's mind. The fact that that isn't statistically representative doesn't even come into it. And if you've taken my advice at the beginning of the presentation about really working out who you are and matching it up, just talking about what you've done will be the right answers. One of the things that some interviewers do to you, which personally I don't think is a very good idea, is put you under a foolish amount of pressure by asking you to solve some technical problem, maybe on a whiteboard, under the glare of the spotlight. And my opinion is that when people do that, they'll put on a performance which is perhaps a tenth of what they'd do if they were doing it for real in the job, and interviewers need to be reminded of this. So if you find that pressure uncomfortable, it's probably worth reminding them in a polite way and saying, oh right, okay, just be prepared to multiply by 10 any impressions you get formed by this, because when I'm solving problems like this on the job, I can do a great job, but when I do it under pressure, which hopefully is not what the job's like, I'm not likely to do so well. When you come to explain gaps in your CVs, which by the way are perfectly okay, nobody minds gaps in CVs or changes. What they don't like is deception or masked information. So just be prepared to give cogent, fair, reasonable explanations for gaps. That's fine. Take a paper and pen with you and make notes during an interview. Very few people do that, but it creates a good impression and it will help you. It will help you concentrate. And I don't know why people feel uncomfortable about it. I think it's a good thing. But I would draw the line at taking a laptop and trying to persuade the interview to look at stuff, or even bringing papers for them to read. You really can't win like that. That's not the culture of interviews, so I wouldn't do that. And as far as how demonstrative you are, I should draw the line at dancing and hugging the interviewer. But standing up and using the whiteboard to explain a point is good. Don't feel you have to ask permission. That's the sort of thing in a relaxed, real meeting you just do, so do it. These are things that your stories should seek to mop up. Probably the most important is anything dangling or left over from maybe areas of a test you might have done which weren't so strong, or gaps in your CV. Drivers' attitudes, trust and responsibility are things which your personality type very much connected with, and you should have a pretty good grasp of those now, so be prepared to have stories which illustrate those in the favourable light. Interviewers are very interested in your self-awareness, because that will tell them about your attitude to developing the job and maybe compensating deliberately from your innate personality weaknesses. They'll be interested in the craft skills connected with software development, things like approaches to testing and design. And in the higher end of hiring, companies will be particularly interested in how smart you are. So again, try and provide some evidence that suggests you're smart. They'll be interested in how you want to grow, whether you want to become a specialist or whether you want to become a broader generalist. If you're particularly smart, they might want to see if you've traded that for common sense, which isn't uncommon. They'll want to see how brave you are when you're confronted with 3 million lines of badly organised code. Make sure you're brave enough to know that the right thing to do is fix it properly. If they don't know that that's important, by the way, probably best not to go and work there. They'll be very interested in how you handle and approach relationships, and they'll look at this on multiple dimensions. They'll look at how you work with your peers in terms of dealing with difficulties, but also contributing, creating something greater than the sum of the parts. They'll look at how you think they should work with a manager, because being easy to manage is extraordinarily valuable to a hirer. They'll look at how you deal with people you supervise, and they'll look with how you deal with people who you meet, maybe consumers of your software, and understand the different values. Most good managers will want people that are very assertive, people that say, actually boss, I'm not sure that's quite right, have you thought about this? They'll want to see how sophisticated a communicator you are, both in speaking, listening, reading and writing, but also choosing the right channel for the right job, whether it be email, text, speaking, face-to-face, etc., etc. And they'll be very keen if you've got this sort of somewhat magical delivery factor. And again, most of these are very amenable to having a story which shows you in a good light. This bloke in the picture has gone to slightly hilarious lengths to avoid accepting that leaflet, because he knows deep down, subconsciously, like most human beings, that the concession of taking it gets him on the hook. He's then obliged to enter in the conversation, and that's the principle of reciprocity. There's a lovely example in the book about a waiter that is asked advice by his diners as to what they should have for their main course, and he pretends to covertly guide them away from one of the dishes because it's not going too well. And that little gesture of completely artificial trust and empathy buys him sort of favours from the diners, so that when they then ask him what they should have for pudding and what wine they should choose, they accept his recommendations of very high profit margin or very expensive choices. Apparently it's quite common. There's a kind of equivalent to that in an interview, where if you make a little concession like the waiter, anything you say afterwards is more likely to be trusted and believed. So if you make a harmless concession about something you're not very good at, you can then make a very powerful point about something you are good at, which is important. You can also gain a sense of social debt, if you like, from the interviewer by taking a very keen interest in a topic that they perhaps seem to be very keenly interested in. And the good thing about that is it sometimes presents a pretext for prolonging your exposure to the interviewer, because you could maybe follow up a few days later and say, I came across this, I thought you might be interested. I think references are greatly underused in selection because they're very good quality pieces of evidence from very well informed and unbiased people. But there we are. Whether they're gold dust or a liability for you depends on your preparation. You can get the upper hand with preparation, by which I mean having the names of a couple of people and their contact details, preferably mobile phone numbers, on a piece of paper. Then when the topic comes up in the interview, just pull it out and say, well, I did bring some with me, I thought that might make it a bit easier for you. And because it does, the interviewer is most likely going to accept that and think, well, that's all the evidence I need. There are clearly two people that are willing to give this person singing praises, and he's just proved it by offering me that piece of paper. That's what I mean by fait accompli. A more skillful interviewer, though, will defeat that by picking up on one of the parts of the conversations, one of the stories you've told about something that didn't go quite so well in one of the firms, and he'll ask if he can ring up that person. And you've got to think very carefully what you say then, because it's an absolute trap for saying something negative. Now, there's often plenty of negative things to say at that point, but you've got to find a way out of that. It may be that the person was a wally. It may be that they were horrible. It may be a personality clash, whatever. But none of those are going to help you. They're just going to make things worse. If you think the person is going to ring them up and say something negative, I would say something along the lines of, I would grin and say, oh, that's going to be interesting, because I've got to admit, we didn't always see eye to eye, but if you do find out, do let me know. I'll be intrigued as to how he describes it. And that gives you a sense of confidence that, it reminds everybody that things can be looked at from two different points of view. These are some things you should try and avoid happening in interviews. It's pretty obvious you shouldn't be late. Perhaps less obvious that being excessively early is similarly awkward. 1 in 10 people allow their phone to go off, which mystifies me. It's so avoidable. And people quite often interrupt when you're speaking in interviews, which again, any kind of bad manners is just making it less likely they're going to want to employ you. So really turn it on. Lying and exaggerating is a tricky one. I think it's pretty plain you shouldn't lie, but I think you've got a license to exaggerate a teeny bit in an interview. It's kind of shared expectation. But don't, whatever you do, paint yourself into a corner or lay a trap for yourself, because as soon as you lose credibility, you lose all credibility, not just credibility on that one point. It's very easy to be negative without realising, and the typical pitfalls are describing conflict situations or giving reasons for moving from one job to another, which cast negative light on something or someone. Find a way of explaining all those things which is entirely positive. You lead a positive, buoyant journey through life, period, as far as interviews are concerned. Negotiating, talking about self-interest like training, and expressing sort of quasi-political views, maybe connected with, say, your views on open source and the role of people like Microsoft and Apple. Avoid all that. The interviewer doesn't want to know your political views. Even if they agree with you, it doesn't actually help you get the job offer, and they might disagree with you, in which case the opposite is true. So very restrained. Pretend you're in the officer's mess, no politics or religion. So just to summarise on some of the most frequently occurring sources of negativity, and I don't think any of these you can ask about to improve the likelihood of you getting a job offer, which, given that is your goal in the interviewer, means you shouldn't talk about them. Is, can I work from home? What are your arrangements from working from home? Do you have flexi time? Can I work part-time? What training are you going to offer me? What are you going to do for me about career progression? Can you guarantee that I've got somewhere quiet to work? Can you promise me you're going to give me some really great kit? Can you, what's the pressure like here? And will you pay me relocation? All you're trying to do is get a job offer. How can any of those things make it more likely that you're going to be made a job offer? I've got a few slides now on the kind of questions that you can most likely be asked in an interview. I did a bit of Googling around on what advice to interviewers for questions in an interview, and quite a lot of them came up with technical questions. And to be honest, that they had right or wrong answers, and they were so puerile, I can't be bothered to talk about them. If you get asked questions like that, you either know them or you don't, and I can't give you any advice other than if the interview was that dumb, I wouldn't go and work for the company. These are what Google came up with as suggestions for interview questions about soft skills, which again make me despair. If interviewers ask questions for which there's so obviously a good answer, then I would have thought people would just tell them what they wanted to hear. And if you're faced with questions like this, it probably tells you more about the company and whether it's a good idea to go and work for them than anything else. But if you decide to persevere, I can't imagine that an interviewer is just going to believe your answers when there's so obviously a good answer. But so probably the best way of getting it across is to, again, pull out your stories. Why would we hire you? Well, let's just say it's because you can work very fast. Oh, God. Pull out a story which shows you can work very fast, perhaps. The more sophisticated interviewer is going to conduct the conversation in what seems a pretty chaotic way, but it won't really be. You might start by asking you about a job you enjoyed most, partly because that will give them a whole bunch of jumping off points for natural trails, but also because you'll feel good and get more relaxed. You'll be more at cognitive ease if you start talking about something that you enjoyed. And so he'll then, having heard about your first job, he'll say, well, what was it about that you liked? And you can see what he's probing there. Well, oh yeah, why did you decide to do that? If he wants to get your attitudes to things for which the answers are pretty obvious, like how well you teamwork, he won't ask it directly because he knows you'll tell him the answer he wants to hear. So he'll say, have you ever seen maybe two people in a team not working too well? And you'll start telling him all about your attitudes and understanding of teamwork. If he wants to see what qualities you've got, again, he'll avoid the obvious right answers by giving you an impossible continuum, like, are you nearer the end that's good attention to detail, or are you nearer the end that's intuitive and fast? Most people feel they're on the continuum somewhere, and that's the way a skilled interviewer will probe it. If he wants to find out what you don't like about his job offer, if he's trying to sell the job to you, he'll ask you if you had lots of offers, what would be your criteria for choosing one? He might ask you to admit one negative for each of the job offers. But in all cases, your responses to these are stories. So he asks you a question, you're obliged to answer it. So you pick one of your prepared stories, which includes the answer, but hopefully it includes 6 or 8 point scoring points, other attributes as well. When I ask people at the end of an interview if they've got any questions, most people probably say, well, no, to be honest, I think we've covered everything, which isn't the smartest answer. The least you can do is pull out a piece of paper and say, I did write some down. You don't mind if I just consult them, do you? Because at least it makes it sound as if you're a bit keen and take a keen interest. But I'll remind you of the raison d'etre for being in the interview, which is to secure a job offer. And so you do have questions to ask by definition, because that's my advice. Have some questions, and remember that their only purpose is to make it more likely that you'll get the offer. They're there to strengthen your position. And you do that by asking questions which will build some sense of social capital or reciprocity. So who should the questions be about? Not you, about them. Take an interest in something that's been said. What should you speak about? Well, a topic that they've brought up that they might be interested in. You will probably be able to tell one of the things that the interviewer was personally most interested in during the dialogue. So go back to one of those things. Try and note it when you go past it in the first place. Try not to talk about yourself, and definitely don't ask about salary, because of the few people that do ask questions, they're nearly always self-interested questions. This isn't the time for that. So we have a key change now to what happens at the end of the interview and afterwards. Whether you ask for feedback at the end of the interview depends strongly on what style of interview it was. If it was a warm, open interview, then it's a good thing to ask for feedback. Quite apart from what you learn about the answers, it creates a good assertive tone from you. But if it was more of a controlled interview, where the interviewer was trying to keep you in your box, it's a bad idea, because those type of interviewers actually find it quite offensive for some reason. Remember not to try and negotiate yet. That won't help you get the offer, which is all you're trying to do at the moment. And don't play hard to get, but if they say, have you got any other irons in the fire, first of all, be pleased, because it means they're interested in you and they want to find out what the competition is. And usually it's best to say that you have got other irons in the fire, as long as it's true and you can substantiate it. But also say that you prefer the cut of the jib of this one, say that that's the one you're most excited about. It's important to make a positive exit, by which I mean a smile, body language, a few carefully chosen words, a thank you. And it's really hard, because by this time you're relieved it's over, you're probably very mentally tired, but just gird yourself for one last push and beam at the guy or the woman and make a positive impression as you go. Try and find a pretext for staying in touch. That can make a big difference. The longer you stay in the consciousness of the interviewer, the better your chances. And don't chase them up. If they're interested in you, they'll be chasing you up. They'll be in a hurry. They'll want to secure you before the competition does, and they don't want to hang about. They may have to hang about because often they've got to go up the chain to get sign-off. But there's nothing you can do to gain by chasing the interviewer up, and all you can do is harm, so it's best to avoid that. So this slide is all about when you're rejected for a job offer. And we've been conditioned by our lives to treat rejection as something very unpleasant, and in the normal social context, I suppose it is. But this isn't the normal social context. Being rejected just means that you weren't the most favoured, that's all. And you should view it as inevitable and routine, and think about the statistics. It's not really a rejection. It's just not being the best. It's like all it's proved is that you didn't win the race. That's not a rejection. Should you believe the feedback you get as to the reason? Well, it might be true, but it might not be. If the real reason was that they didn't like you, or the real reason was they didn't think you were clever enough, or that you wouldn't get on with the team, they probably won't tell you that because it's just too difficult and there's no incentive. So just treat with caution the feedback you get as to the reason. A lot of people after interviews treat job agencies, if they've got the job through an agency, as a kind of leper, which is a very bad idea. That agency might be representing you next time. There might be some kind of recall where you need dependent on the agency again. And the agency might tell the hirer how you behaved. Outcome bias is a psychological phenomenon where, because of our desire in our subconscious for coherency and to make everything fit patterns, we tend to build explanations for events which match the outcome once we know the outcome. It's quite useful to look up, and it's almost impossible to avoid doing that in this situation. Oh, well, it was probably because of blah, blah, blah. That's not going to help you much. If you want to wring value out of the, in quotes, rejection, what you need to do is think about things that maybe you can recognise didn't go quite as well as you would wish, that maybe are in your gift to make better next time, and then work at doing so. So let's talk about when you're offered a job after an interview. Whoopie-doo-dah, congratulations! Now is the time to negotiate. And the reason that I kept saying you shouldn't do so before, well, there are two reasons. The first is it's a distraction. The two previous phases have a single objective, which unless you contain them and restrain yourself to dealing with them alone, you won't do it as well as you could. But the most important reason is this thing called the endowment effect. And it's the subconscious psychological bias we have, which that when something belongs to us, our perception of its value is very much greater than if it didn't belong to us. And that change can take place in minutes. These symbols in the pictures reflect one of the most famous established experiments about it. Now it's relevant here because once somebody makes an offer to you, they own the concept of you going to work for them. It's their idea. They are now endowed with that idea, and they will perceive the value of succeeding in hiring you as very much higher than before they'd decided, and it stands to reason that your negotiating position is therefore very much stronger. Take the help of the agencies in negotiations. They really are expert at it. Think about it, they do it all day long. Have a reality check. There's often not all that much scope for salary negotiation in these types of jobs, mainly because companies are obliged for all sorts of reasons, good and procedural, to stick to certain salary bands for certain people. Also think about in your negotiations what's important. The whole tone of this talk has been that you should get a life that you like, rather than just earn as much money as possible. And so trade in your own mind what life is going to give you, how satisfied, how happy you're going to be with the money Sorry if that sounds patronising. If you want to ask about money, ask about the long term. How are people rewarded over time? Try and form a view about how much value you think you could offer that company, and try and work out in your own mind how much earnings potential that should give you as a consequence of their mechanisms for rewarding it. So we have another key change now, and we're going to speak about your personal brand, which I'm sure you find a faintly revolting prospect. Not that sort of brand, that sort of brand. Putin's photographs are creating the brand that you probably accept. You've probably bought it without even realising that he's got at least some ownership of the idea of being an outdoor sort of hunting, shooting, fishing action man. But ask yourself this: how do you think the next Dyson product will be any good, or the next Gucci products, or the John Lewis products, or what do you perceive as the brand of Co-op? Brands really do make a difference to how we react to the prospect of something. They give us a sort of context in which to think about things, and you need to have one if you want to compete with other people in the jobs market. And LinkedIn is just about the bee's knees for this. There is no excuse not to have a great brand projected by LinkedIn, and most recruiters nowadays will look you up on LinkedIn. And I'm just amazed at how appallingly and complacently most people treat it. It's a heaven-sent opportunity which is totally neglected. You need to go back to a sort of waterfall approach again. What are the requirements? When you're on the jobs market, what do you want when somebody goes and has a look at you? What impressions do you want to create? Think about the messages you want to create, and then create your LinkedIn profile from the ground up to match that. Don't worry about anything else. I've done it for me, not to get a job, but in my professional capacity. So you can use that as an example. That is a crafted LinkedIn profile which tries to project the messages that I want to. And this talk will end up on it, and that's all part of it. I'm trying to show that I know a thing or two about leading software development people, because I do, and that's part of what I want to project. And this talk does it. That's my personal brand. People think of LinkedIn as being little more than a list of the jobs you've done, but it's become a lot more than that. These are things that it gives you an opportunity to put in. And if you do a good job of satisfying all these, you hardly need to go to an interview. You can paint a very comprehensive picture of who you are. There's a sort of summary elevator pitch you can get across. There's the job history, obviously, but you can put in publications, you can put in your interests, you can subscribe to groups, and you can make it easy for people to contact you. Surprising how many people don't do that. You have to opt in to making it easy for people to contact you, and so just with a few button clicks you can at least make it possible for someone to email you directly. This is a bit strong, but I think it's true. You're stupid if you ignore getting yourself a good personal brand on LinkedIn if you want to be taken seriously on the jobs market and compete with people who are as good as you. Maybe there'll be somebody just as good as you, but they haven't got such a good personal brand. Who's going to get the job? Quite a lot of people don't prepare enough for interviews, and quite a lot of people prepare a lot, but not necessarily the right things. And these things I've got on the screen here, the amount of preparation and research you should do in relation to each one varies enormously. The company and the company's product or technology, you need to research just enough to show respect. But because you can't catch up with the experts when you go and meet them at the interview, there's a limited return on effort in studying it further than that. Nobody really expects you to be an expert in their product or their company. They just expect you to have taken a respectable interest to show that you have some integrity, really. The role, however, you should study. You should study it exhaustively, because without doing so, you'll miss opportunities to sell yourself and demonstrate value. And the same applies to your value proposition, by which I mean some of the stuff that's come earlier about understanding who you are and what you've got to offer. You can't really research that enough and be prepared too much for that. And it's not worth putting too much effort into researching the personalities or the people who are going to interview you. Again, you might hit lucky and find out something about them that you can talk to, but that's not going to get you very far. There's other bits of preparation as well. It's an intensely demanding experience, an interview, intellectually, if you're going to do it well, a bit like doing a really good exam, a university exam. So get some sleep in several days beforehand. That'll make a difference. If you're full of beans and you're intellectually charged up, plan the journey so that you're not stressed about being late and not tired from a very long drive. Plan it out, get ready in advance, relax, and then enjoy it when you get there, but don't forget to concentrate. So I'm going to wrap up now. I hope you've enjoyed the material and I hope it's been useful. I hope you've enjoyed the many sound effects I've unwittingly added to this voice recording. I'm conscious of hair dryers in the background, people walking along corridors, cups being dropped, doors closing, washing machines whirring. I'm sure that's added inordinately to it for you. And I'd like to not only give you my contact details here, but encourage you to get in contact. I'm a keen student of this topic and I'd very much like to have dialogue with people who find it interesting too. So don't hesitate to get in contact with any of these channels. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.